Hello everyone, welcome back to the Flight here, recapping day 8 of the Men's World Championship happening here in Denmark and Stockholm, Sweden. So we'll hop into today, of course, with the scores from today's game, starting with a 5-2 victory for Austria over France. Now, this was a game that coming in was kind of an important game for both these teams. For Austria, it was sort of their last stand. Obviously, then from here on out, they basically will need to win out if they want a shot to make the quarterfinals, and then from there, kind of on them to do something in them. For France, every game matters for them from here on in. They're trying to avoid relegation. Quarterfinals not really in their sights at this year's tournament, but in many ways, it's just a matter of trying to get out of that relegation spot and keeping the team alive for at least one more year. And we saw a little bit of that in today's game where, for Austria, they came out hot. They knew that they had the shot to make the quarters, and they played their style for the first, 10, 15 minutes, and they went up early. They went up 3-0. And from there on in, it was a game of, for Austria, it was a game of them playing their style of hockey. And we saw that, with the way that they played through the full 60 minutes. But, we also saw a little bit of France coming back in, especially towards the end of this game. The third period onwards, I'd say the French looked like a very equal team to Austria, which I think on paper they are. But we saw that desperation factor from Austria that they know they have to win these games and the back's against the wall. That's where we saw that first, 40-ish minutes of hockey really favor Austria. And, of course, France scores a goal. The momentum's a little bit shifted. And then the goalie gets pulled. France scores one. Then, Austria scores one. And then France scores one right after. And then they score the second empty net goal to make it a 5-2 hockey game. So, for Austria, a big 3 points in the standings. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a little bit. But when you look at this team and this Austrian team, they're a dangerous team at this tournament. You've seen the way they've played against teams the likes of Sweden and Finland, and the Canada one not so much, but they've played against the top teams and held close with the top teams at this tournament. And now you're going to get to see them play against some of the weaker end teams at this tournament, in Group A at least, and they should be getting these points. And they obviously already beat Slovakia. Now it's a matter if they can beat Latvia, and I think that Latvia game is really going to determine which team ends up in that fourth quarterfinal spot. Not to say that a team like Slovakia can't find their way through, but it's a lot more difficult for them with already one loss against this Austrian team where they're going to be competing for that spot. So for Austria, they can continue that success and the way they've been playing. They are a very dangerous team, especially if they can make the quarterfinals. Because you're looking at Group B, and Group B is a little bit of a mess up right now where it could be the Czechs in the top spot. It could be Switzerland. And then, maybe an outside shot for the U.S. and Germany, although that's seeming very unlikely as these days go onward. But the one thing I will say about, a team like Switzerland is they play a certain style, and same with the Czechs, where I think Austria can very well contend with them. So, not saying it's a guarantee that Austria is going to win in the quarterfinals if they make it, but I think that they do have an outside shot to do it, a very underdog shot at that. But we'll now move to the second game of the day, and this was one that I would say was very frustrating for the Swedish team. And we've talked about it a lot at this tournament for Sweden, where it was a 4-0 win today against Slovenia, but it hasn't been a very well-played tournament for the Swedish team, and not necessarily in the fact that they haven't dominated play or in that sort of sense, but more so finding the back of the net. And what they've been doing especially poorly in these last couple games is they've been too pretty, and we saw that especially evident in that first period where they tried to make the perfect play to sort of walk through the team and make the last pass. And the thing about Slovenia is that if you're going to do that, they're going to pick the puck off because they're hounding the middle of the ice, which just means you're probably not going to get those chances. But we saw the tactical shift in the second period, which carried into the third period, where it was about pucks on net. You shoot the puck, you get into the corners, and then you try and find the empty net. And for this Swedish team, I think that was a much better approach today, and they kind of got a little bit away from what they've been doing, and in many ways that was a good thing. But the one thing that does worry me is the fact that they didn't start this game like that, and they're not starting games trying to be a goal-scoring team. They're trying to be pretty. They're trying to make everything look great. But that's not how you're going to win hockey games, especially against some of the better teams at this tournament. We saw that struggle with the Finns, where every pass was basically ending up on a finished stick aside from the outside shots, and that's exactly what Sweden does. There are Finland and Czechia and Switzerland do so well, and Germany as well. U.S. not so much, but they find ways to take away that middle of the ice. And I think if you look at the way that this Swedish team is comped, they should be a team that's going to put the puck in the back of the net, 6-7 times in a game, especially against some of these weaker teams. Unfortunately, they haven't quite been that yet at this tournament, and outside of their depth scoring that we saw against Slovakia, it hasn't been a great offensive tournament for them. So I just think for the Swedes, it's about getting back to the basics. Pucks out in net all of a sudden, and then sort of charging in. They're looking for it to be too pretty, and that's causing a lot of problems. And we've seen some offensive rushes or counter rushes coming the other way. And if you play against a team like Czechia, or you play against a team like Switzerland, or even a team like Germany, they're going to bury those chances. So for Sweden, just continuing to find ways to be gritty around the net. That's how they're going to that's how they're going to score. And hands down, that's one of the things they've been missing from this tournament. So I just think for Sweden, yes, they win this game, great, 3 points, never complain about 3 points. But I think it's a game that they're going to look back on and wish they would have had a little bit of momentum. Elias Lindholm with the hat tricks today for the Swedes. He was really the only one, and not to take away from the Slovenian goaltender, because he was great. But it seemed like Lindholm was the only player that could find a way past the Slovenian goaltender today. So I just think, for Sweden, it's about finding ways to generate offense in a game that you're not, because you look at their quarterfinal opponents, you're likely playing Germany or you're playing the U.S. I think a team like Germany, they're going to do very similar to what this kind of Slovenian team did against them, except they're going to bury their chances, and then vice versa. If you play the U.S., it's going to be a scoring battle. So we'll see who can win that one mano a mano, but it should be interesting nonetheless. Now we'll move over to the news with Austria today, and they look good. And I think that when you look at the way Austria played, that's what they need to do. And they're on track to continue their momentum throughout this tournament. And for Austria, it's win or go home. And they need to win basically out to make this quarterfinals. And they're a good team, and they are on a roll right now. So we'll see whether or not they can continue that success the rest of the tournament. Then to France we go with little and late. For France today, it was, for France, it wasn't a game that I think they would be overly proud of. They needed something in the middle, or at least to stifle that original Austrian front. And I'm not sure they got that today. And yes, you get the goal, I think 10 minutes left in the third roughly. But you needed something else after that. And yes, the third period was a little bit tighter than, say, the first two. But when you're down 3-0 early, then all of a sudden you let Austria get into their defensive structure, and it's very hard to come back against a team like Austria. So I just think that for this French team, they're going to go up against Slovenia in a couple days' time. It's going to be the one that's going to determine that relegation spot. They're going to need some offense, and they're going to need some momentum changers, where we haven't really seen that. And outside of that Finland game, where frankly they probably should have won it, that could have done that had a very different tournament impact. And I think for France today, little and late is kind of the storyline, where they just couldn't quite get it done. And an unfortunate end, I'd say, for the French in this one, where this was a game they needed. Fortunately, they didn't get it. And now it's basically a battle for the relegation spot. Then to the other relegation partner with Slovenia, who's going to be a tough out. And you look at the way they play, and yes, I'd be remiss not to talk about how well Sweden played today, and not necessarily in the fact that they got high-quality chances, because I just basically went on a tangent about how Sweden didn't play well. But they did dominate a lot of play, and they spent a lot of time in the Slovenian end. But it impressed me with how well Slovenia defended, and they were able to limit a lot of the Swedish chances, especially to the middle of the ice. And that's exactly what you're going to need to do against a team like France, where they're going to be an outside perimeter team that's going to try and, take outside shots and get inside and try and find the rebounds. That's going to be something I'm interested to see how well Slovenia can defend that. Because if Slovenia can find a way to defend it, it's a very dangerous thing, especially against the French team, where they're struggling to find offense at times. And now it's just a matter of if they can, find a way through that. For Slovenia, they're going to try and shut it down, find a tight game that they can find a goal or two in. If they can find it early, like we've seen them do at this tournament, don't be surprised to see a Slovenia upset over France. So that's what we have here for Slovenia. Then to Sweden with a little bit too pretty today, but not just today, the rest of the tournament as well. Once you get it going, you find offensive chances, high quality chances. Sometimes the best shot is just a one on net and you find the rebound and you try and find your way through the traffic. Today was just a little bit too pretty, too many passes. Get back to the basics of hockey, shoot the puck and go and find the rebound. So Sweden today too pretty. We'll now move over to Group B. With the first game of the day between Denmark and Hungary. And this was a game, if you remember back to yesterday's video, we talked about it a little bit more extensively. But for Denmark, it was this, they have to more or less win out to make the quarterfinals. Very similar to Austria. For Hungary, they've done what they've needed to at this turn. They beat the Kazakhs, and now it's about any extra point you can find. The more points you can get, obviously the higher in the standings you end up, but also, especially for this Hungary team, a better chance to avoid having to worry about Kazakhstan getting a point or two in their next couple games. I just think that for Hungary today, they started hot and they went up 2-0 early, and it was starting to become a thing. And you think about this Danish team and you're thinking there's no real way that they lose to Hungary, and that's what knocks them out of this tournament on home ice. And then sure enough, they get the goal shortly after the Hungary second one. And then you see Denmark take control of the game. And by the third period, it was all Denmark. And that's the kind of game that I would have expected from this Danish team against Hungary. They took a little bit longer than I would have expected to get going. But you get the goalie pull. And fun fact about today's game, both goalies ended up getting pulled in this one. But you let in 2 goals on 3 shots. It's a very tough thing to come back from. So for Denmark, they found their way through this one. They got the win. They got the big 3 points in the standings, and they stay alive in the quarters. As for Hungary, they're still waiting. And I think for Hungary, they've done what they've needed to at this tournament. Now it's up to fate to let it decide. Obviously, Norway today was a loser as well. But I think when you look at kind of what's going on with Hungary, they're a team that's done everything they've needed to, and they can accept that. And every point now is gravy for them. It all comes down to what happens with Kazakhstan. So for Hungary, a well-played game today. Unfortunately, they just couldn't hold on long enough. For Denmark, a little bit of a slow start, but really found their groove towards the end. That's what I was more or less expecting throughout the entire game. But still, an 8-2 victory is a well-earned win at that for the Danes. So second game of the day between Switzerland and Norway, a 3-0 win for the Swiss. And this was a dominant effort. Don't let this score fool you. Switzerland in this game dominated Norway from start to finish. And I can't remember. I'm 95% sure I didn't see a shot from Norway in the third period. They might have got one late as well. But, for the Swiss, this is the kind of game that you want to see. Going, especially against a tough Norway team, where we saw Norway come back against the U.S. just the other day. And Norway's a team fighting for their tournament lives, and Switzerland's looking for the top of Group B, which many people, including myself, was not expecting. But they've found ways to win hockey games, and I think for the Swiss, they can continue to find that. That's where they're going to be real good at this tournament. We'll see whether or not Switzerland's able to keep this going, and we'll talk about the injury in just a few minutes here. But for Switzerland, these are the games that you want to play, especially against some of the better teams at this tournament. You can continue to find ways to stifle the opponent. That's when you find a lot of opportunities, and the Swiss capitalized on just about all their opportunities today, and missed on a couple too. And I thought they played a real good game. And then for Norway, just unfortunately got beat by a better opponent today, and the Swiss really controlled Norway for a lot of this one. Unfortunately, Norway needing the points just won't find it in this one. So that's what we have here for the games. When I move to the news, for Hungary, a hot start. They played really well off the opening face-off, found ways to generate offense, and that's one of the things that was interesting about this Hungarian team was, were they going to be a defensive or offensive team? And they came out very defensive throughout this entire tournament. And then we saw them kind of open it up a little bit against Kazakhstan, and then they kind of went back to their defensive shell. And now it's a matter of, for Hungary, they're just waiting. And I know I'm going to say this a lot, but for them, they're waiting to see what happens with Kazakhstan. But I do think that they will be okay. And then for Denmark, with the hot finish today, they scored 8 consecutive goals. You can't really complain about that. But I do think that for the Danes, if they can continue to play that way in that back 2 periods for the full 60, I think that they could make a real mark and potentially even upset Germany, knocking them out of the 4th spot at this tournament. So something to keep an eye on for Denmark. If they can find their game for the full 60 minutes, they're dangerous. But if they start playing like they did in the first 10-ish minutes of the game, they're going to struggle at this for the rest of this tournament. So as we have here for Denmark, and then to Norway we go with desperation. And for this Norway team and this Norwegian team, they're desperate now, and they need a win, and they need a win in a bad way. And the one thing I will also draw some attention to is they're going to play Hungary, and they're going to play Denmark. Two teams that in my eyes are beatable at this tournament. It's not like they have to go through the Czechs and Switzerland, or the Czechs and the USA. There's two teams at this tournament that are beatable, and I think that for Norway, if they can find a way to get one win, all of a sudden they're in a much better spot. And I think when you look at it, it's a little bit unfortunate for them that their final two games are against some of the easier teams in this division. But they are at a winner-go-home stage now. And I think, when you look at it, it's dangerous time for this Norway team, as they're going to see the desperation come the next few days. And, we're going to see tomorrow as Norway takes on Denmark, we're going to see the Norway team fighting for their lives. And it would not surprise me, just like in that final third against the US, that all of a sudden this game's going to get warped. So for Norway, I thought it was a good enough game for them today. But I think they're going to have to play a lot more desperate in these final games to be able to find the back of the net and sort of control the pace of play and sort of turn it on its head like we've seen them do at this tournament against some of the better teams. And unfortunately, they just didn't have it today against the Swiss. The Swiss did a real good job of controlling the Norwegian pushes, and they just couldn't quite hang on today against Switzerland, but they're going to need it for their next two games against Hungary and Denmark. So that'll do it for Norway. Now to the final one with Switzerland, with Nico Hischier is injured and out. And this is a huge loss for the Switzerland team, where they need a little bit of that push. And I think you look at what Hischier brings. He's going to bring a full 200-foot game, but he's also going to bring a little bit of offense. He's going to bring a little bit of leadership. The things that you're looking for out of, that kind of caliber of player. And for Switzerland, it very well could be the reason why they have some problems in the eventual quarterfinals, or maybe even the semifinals, assuming they can get through the top of the divisions. They are looking pretty good right now in Group B. They've beaten a lot of the teams they need to. Now it's just a matter of who's going to end up as that third and fourth place team in Group A, and where does Switzerland finish, because you're kind of looking at a Finland. Finland, I think, could very well be it. Obviously, it'll come down to what happens with the Czechs and Switzerland. But I think for the Czechs, or for Switzerland rather, if they do end up in that second spot, you're likely playing the Finns. And if you play the Finns, it's going to be a very long game if you struggle to find some offense. So, for Switzerland, it's a big loss today with Hischier, but one that I think is very much warranted. Warranted might not be the word, but it's one that, you're going to miss in the lineup. And I think that is going to be one of the biggest things that Switzerland will look back on at this tournament if they don't go very far, and say, that was probably a pretty big reason. And I never like to you'll find I don't normally call players out by name in these kind of videos, but he's a player that I think really was going to help Switzerland, especially when they get into the better competition at this tournament. But that'll do it here for our games of the day. We'll now move into the standings. So we'll start here in Group A with Sweden in first place with 15 points, Canada in second with 12, Finland in third with 8 points, Slovakia in fourth place with 7, Latvia in fifth place with 6, Austria in sixth place with 5, France in seventh with 1 point, and Slovenia with 5 regulation losses in last place in Group A. And then to Group B we will go, where we'll find Switzerland in first place with 13 points, Czechia in second with 11, Germany in third with 9, USA in fourth with 8, Denmark in fifth place with 6, Hungary in sixth place with 3 points, Kazakhstan in seventh with 3 as well, and Norway in last place with 1. A reminder that Hungary does own the tiebreaker over Kazakhstan with the head-to-head. So that means for Kazakhstan, they need a point, and they need to find a point against some of the better teams at this tournament. So it's going to be a tough sled for them to try and, sort of scrounge up a point. I highly doubt it's going to happen. So I think what's going to come down to in that final spot is if Norway can somehow find their way to sort of get above Hungary, and that's, once again, it's going to kind of come down to Kazakhstan versus Hungary, unless Kazakhstan can find a way to scrounge up a point, and then all of a sudden that game between Hungary and Norway becomes very, very important. So could be interesting. Lots still to play for these teams, especially on the bottom half of Group B. The other game in the bottom of Group A that might be notable is France and Slovenia coming up in also a couple days. That one's likely going to determine who gets relegated in the bottom of Group A. But that will do it now for the standings. We'll flip into tomorrow's game starting in Group A for May 17th at 6:20 a.m. Eastern Time between France and Latvia. This is going to be a really good game. And you might be thinking, well, France is a lot better of or Finland rather is a lot better of a team. But no, I wouldn't go that far. And I think Latvia has made some serious strides these last few years. And you're going to look for a guy like Dons Lockmelis, who's going to be taking that next step for this Latvian team. And we'll see whether or not he's going to be a guy that they can heavily rely upon to get them past the Finns, where this Finnish team, we've talked about it a lot at this tournament, isn't the Finnish team of old. And yes, they just smoked Slovenia the other day. But we've also seen them play some really poor games, especially against teams like France. That was one that I think many people could agree on that wasn't a great game. And for Finland, they're lucky to be able to get points out of that game and eventually get the win. But they very much should have lost that game, especially after you consider the fact that they potted the empty net goal. So we'll see whether or not, for Finland, they're able to compete against Latvia tomorrow. Latvia, I would expect to play their full 60-minute game. If all of a sudden the game gets a little lopsided, Finland gets some momentum. We've seen Latvia struggle with that at this tournament, but if the longer this game stays close, the better chances a team like Latvia is going to have. So don't be surprised to see this game go either way. I would expect Finland to win, but I think it will be a lot tighter than most people might think. Then to the second game, we go between Sweden and France. Sweden, I would assume, would take this game, but honestly with France, they are a team that could bring their best game tomorrow, or they could get absolutely blown out. It's just going to come down to which French team does show up. And for Sweden, see where they go, see if they get too fancy. Might be something to keep an eye on there. Then to the 2:20 game we go between Canada and Slovakia. I would expect Canada to walk all over Slovakia on this one. Very similar to what we saw in that Sweden-Slovak game off the top of the tournament. But I will be interested to see, because obviously Canada, they haven't had too much of a challenge at this tournament yet. I don't believe that we've seen them, kind of have that moment of, I don't know about this game. I think we've seen them really take control, but time will tell. And I think Slovakia is one of those teams that if you take them too lightly, they will bury you. So, for Canada, playing a full 60 minutes tomorrow, they'll be okay. But if they start to take, time off, or they take little moments where they don't play to their best, that's when you see Slovakia take control. So would expect Canada to dominate this game, but you really never know. Game of the day in Group A is going to be between Finland and Latvia. Then to Group B, we will go with the U.S. taking on Germany at 6:20 a.m. Eastern. Then this will be a game that I honestly think, is one that could honestly go either way. And, at the start of this tournament, I thought the USA would have dominated this game, and not so much dominated, but really controlled the pace and, kind of hemmed Germany into their own end. And then you see a couple chances coming back and forth. But now I think this game is going to be a very much toss-up. And for the U.S., they haven't looked great these last couple days. And, you take a look at the Switzerland loss. You also couple that, of course, with the Norway blown lead in the third period. They're a team who's struggling right now, and I would not be surprised to see some problems come out of that. But time will tell. And I think for Germany, if they can find ways to put some pressure on the U.S., especially early, don't be surprised to see Germany take this one. But for the U.S., they need to find some goals early. And I think if they can find the goals early, they'll be okay. Longer this game goes, the more it's probably going to favor the Germans in this. But of course, time will tell. And then the second game we go between Czechia and Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan's looking and scrounging for any point they can to get out of the relegation spot. For Czechia, they're looking to win this game in regulation. I would expect the Czechs to dominate from start to finish today and blow the living daylights out of Kazakhstan, but you really never know. Then to the third game of the day we go between Denmark and Norway at 2:20 p.m. Eastern Time. This is going to be a game that I think is going to determine, in many respects, what's going to happen in Group B. And for Denmark, it's a must-win. For Norway, in many ways, it's a must-win, although Norway will be playing against Hungary later in the tournament, which will likely be the determiner of who gets relegated. But I think, for Norway, if they can find a win against Denmark, all of a sudden their path against Hungary becomes that much easier. So for Norway, very important game. For Denmark, also a very important game. Look for both these teams. This one, I think, will be your game of the day, although the Germany-US one will also be as well. The Finland-Latvia one are kind of my big 3 games of the day. I think those are maybe the games to keep an eye on. But with that, if you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching. Please drop a like if you like, subscribing, tell all your friends down below your thoughts on the day of the Men's World Championship. Until next time.